Hey guys, so we're going to take a break from our regularly scheduled rhymes, and I wanted to hop on actually and make a video essentially about how the way that we attach early on in life to our caregivers oftentimes can negatively affect the way that we're showing up in our relationships in adulthood. So I wanted to go over attachment theory, which is essentially a psychological theory that focuses specifically on relationship bonds, especially long-term bonds, and how they're formed, um, starting early on in the parent-child relationships and then moving into romantic relationships as we age. So the theory essentially is shedding light on how we develop and are showing up in our relationships. So basically, these are coping skills that we have learned and adopted starting from when we were very young, based on how our parents parented, however, did not necessarily discard when this coping was no longer needed when we grew up to be an adult. So, this theory is going to articulate four different styles of attachment that we develop in childhood, which again is formed directly from our relationship with our guardians. So, the first style is anxious attachment. Essentially, this is characterized by the child being extremely anxious or distressed when separated from their parent. This style typically develops from not being able to consistently depend on the primary caregiver to meet their socio emotional or even physical needs. So, translating into adulthood, this may look like being afraid of emotion, intimacy, or even emotional closeness, having poor personal boundaries, being needy or clingy. These individuals may crave intimacy, but also equally have a hard time trusting others. Um, People with this attachment style tend to need constant reassurance and can be anxious or jealous in relationships. So, one way to, of course, after recognizing to focus on kind of mitigating this attachment style later on in life is focus on learning to communicate better, focus on our communication style. Um, Learn and research ways to be comfortable with expressing emotions, learning nonverbal cues, partner with someone who is securely attached, which we'll go over here in a little bit. Again, always even seeking professional therapy services can assist. Now, the second attachment style is avoidant attachment. So this style is going to look like children avoiding caregivers or showing no preference between a caregiver and a complete stranger. Typically, this type of attachment is going to result from either neglectful or abusive parenting behaviors and sometimes even harsh treatment as a result of attempting to rely on a caregiver. So, asking for assistance, reassurance, guidance from a caregiver, and then being met with punishment oftentimes can result in avoidant attachment. So, this translates again into adulthood if we're the kind of person that may, keep a certain distance from others. Uh, People with this attachment style are unlikely to seek help. They fear or may fear intimacy. They may appear to be distant or cold. They may suppress outward displays of emotion or feel that that's weak. They're very self-reliant, bordering on isolation, and can also have a lack of emotional closeness. So, in order to, of course, begin healing this attachment wound, we have to acknowledge it, like any of the other ones. Then, by really understanding that we're avoiding vulnerability, practicing avoidance and the vulnerability of in oneself, we can actually work to allow ourselves to more consciously open to this. Again, research different ways to become vulnerable, different questions to be asked and to ask of yourself that allows us to be vulnerable. So, the next and third attachment style is disorganized attachment. This style is essentially characterized by a display of a confusing mix of behaviors. And children that have this attachment style often seem dazed or disoriented or even potentially confused. They may resist or avoid their primary caregiver, who can be often associated with providing both feelings of comfort and fear. So This, of course, reflects inconsistency in caregiving behavior and thus may lead to disorganized behaviors or confused behaviors within the child. So, the way this one translates into adulthood, it may look like having low self esteem, having big trust issues, even poor emotional regulation, or lots of inconsistency in romantic relationships. This one is also people usually are plagued with fear of being emotionally intimate. Another one that kind of works into the trust issues is being anxious or worried about the intentions of others, overly anxious or worried. And then this can also come with a fear of abandonment. So with this one, again, we recognize it. A good way to kind of combat this, or at least become more aware, is journaling is a helpful one for this attachment style to, kind of illuminate patterns of emotion, and kind of realizing what may or may not trigger these specific attachment wounds, so we can begin to work with them. Another one that's good for disorganized attachment styles is if it becomes difficult, or if it tends to be difficult to form partnerships or romantic relationships, we might start with building healthy friendships at first, because we can begin to work on these kinds of things within ourselves, which is kind of easier to do in more of a platonic friendship than necessarily a partnership. Now, the last attachment style that we're going to go over is secure attachment. This style is essentially characterized as when children feel they can depend on their caregiver. They may show normal levels of distress when separated from a parent and normal levels of feeling joy when they're reunited with a parent or caregiver. So, of course, this is accompanied with feelings of reassurance that caregivers will respond appropriately when the child is seeking reassurance or guidance. So as this one translates to adulthood, you can pretty much imagine these people, or people with this attachment style, tend to have a positive view of self and others. They tend to be self-sufficient, but also not afraid to ask for help. They're more trusting. They're good at setting boundaries typically, and more comfortable with intimacy, and just kind of overall emotionally balanced, right? So there's a few other things that we can focus on here, if we want to kind of gear towards and work towards becoming more securely attached within ourselves, so we can show up in our relationships. A couple things. Don't take things personally. Expressed interest in others and what others are doing. Genuine interest, not just fake interest, right? But really take interest. Understand the consequences of actions. Think about the consequences of actions, about our emotional responses to things. Be confident, right? Not arrogant, but confident. Comfortable sharing information, but also respectful of other people's boundaries. And of course, having a good capacity for communication is definitely a reflection of somebody who is more secure in their attachments, I would say. So now the real question, where within these attachment styles do you see yourself or your child self? And are there any parallels or correlations between how you may have developed your attachment in infancy and childhood compared to how you're showing up in your adult relationships? Now, of course, there's a lot of overlap between these wounded attachment styles, and a lot more information available out there as well. So we can see, how important, in terms of self-awareness, examining how we ourselves are showing up in our connections with others. Not only in forming the bonds, but also in sustaining and maintaining our relationships. So we start from a point of acknowledgement, recognition. Then we can begin to move forward on that path to kind of mitigating some of these coping or defense mechanisms that have carried through from our childhood, that may be in fact contrary to our human and spiritual nature. So this is part 1 of a 2-part mini. So since we hit on the word attachment a lot here today, part 2 is going to be on the concept of non-attachment. Definitely a different foundation and philosophy than what we're discussing today completely, but hopefully we'll still offer some value. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you for part two.